Serious, urban explorers of Reddit, what was the creepiest or most mysterious thing you've seen or found during your exploration? My brother had a place close to an abandoned railroad depot. Then there was a box of personal items. The box had homework, personal pictures, and a release form from a teen detention center dated the previous winter. It took seconds to realize the teen was released and shipped to this town and had nowhere to go. He slept for probably a night in this place and then abandoned his only personal possessions. That poor kid. That is heartbreaking. I found a bloody shirt, pants, shoes, and underwear in an old busted down house in the woods. When I say bloody I mean pretty sure somebody was murdered bloody. Might be me making something out of nothing, but nonetheless creepy. There was an old brick building in the middle of my hometown. It was gutted by fire but the walls and ceiling remained. It was some kind of grain mill. The place was huge. There was some awesome graffiti art inside. Anyway, the property was all overgrown and wooded. The place had been abandoned for decades. Whenever we went exploring there, it was mostly inside the building. We decided to explore the woods once. They were very dense and difficult to push through. We found a clearing inside. It was almost perfectly circular. There were logs arranged around the circle. A large star made of sticks was in the middle. There were figures of people made of sticks and twigs hanging from nearby branches. I have no idea what the place was, but it was the creepiest thing I've ever seen. There was an old factory about a mile from my house growing up. I explored it when I was about 13. Must have been abandoned for many years because the 2nd floor had fallen down on the 1st floor. Well, it was winter and I was walking around the 3rd floor and I found 2 really big coolers. Both of them filled to the top of rubber gloves. But these rubber gloves were actually filled with ice, so they looked like there were hands in them. They must have been filled in summer and stayed there till winter. No clue as to what or why. No water or ice in the coolers. Just the full, tied off, rubber gloves. Must have been at least 100 of them. Building was torn down less than a year later. I am not an urban explorer or anything, but when I was around 12-13 I broke into a very small abandoned house near my uncle's cottage. The owner of that house was a man who had died some 20-25 years ago. The whole place was completely untouched, so I am pretty sure the last persons to be there before me were the EMs who locked up after they took away the body. The bed, where the guy died probably, was unmade and messy. The pillow and the blanket were half eaten by moths. Same with the clothes hanging in the closet. Floor was covered in rat crap. There were dirty dishes in the sink which were stained yellow. On the bedroom table there was an open book and some others stacked next to it. In the drawers there was some random stuff. Matchboxes, shaving kit etc. Other than that it seems the guy died completely broke since there was nothing else in the house. No photos or documents. No TV or radio. No extra furniture or any other items. Doors and windows were locked so no one else had been there. The man who died had no relatives according to my uncle and was only 45-50 years old. I once came across a small, single-story office building with one room burned down and only that room. Other rooms had various office supplies. It was weird enough that the only room that had file cabinets was the only one burned. As I went deeper into the building from the front entrance, there was an emptied room with a single chair in the middle of it with an empty gas can next to it. What happened? Why and how will never be answered, and that bothers me. It was a shuttered factory complex in Eastern Europe with a large bunker system underneath the buildings. There were several rooms literally lined with ripped open first aid kits with the empty morphine needles scattered around. Whoever used them was perfectly content to basically live in a damp, dark, partially burnt out musty hole filled with Cold War propaganda and imagery through the duration those needles lasted. Sounds an awful lot like Fallout. Gotta get all the stim packs. I used to live near an abandoned amusement park. In a ballroom basement I found a room filled with dead cats. At least 100 of them. Porno posters on the walls. A hammock with a pillow and an army green wool blanket. Place got burned down about 3 months later. Not so much urban, but my dad and uncles used to take me along on hunting trips quite a bit to our regular stomping grounds in northern central PA. I was 16 and this occurrence really stuck with me. My oldest uncle was a park ranger for the surrounding area, so we had a pretty good handle on the areas we traversed and we stuck to the places we knew. We'd split up and my dad and I would push deer through and my uncles would shoot anything we pushed out. After about an hour solo, my pops and I came across a cemetery in the middle of nowhere. It was spookily quiet. No animal sounds, just snow falling. All these crumbling small stone structures. Some were pre-Civil War. Some were Civil War soldiers. It's hard to make out quite a bit of them, but it was just very out there. It'd be an hour hike from any known road and just spookily untouched. No animal tracks. No nothing. We kinda booked it out of there when my dad tried to radio over to my uncle and nothing was going through. We ended up screaming, hooting, and whistling for him and my other uncle for a good 10 minutes before we caught up. No idea what twilight zone we ended up at, but I remember my dad trying to mark it on the map via the route we took for my uncle so he could at least turn it in for preservation. I just wanted the heck out of the woods. Much of my time is spent in rural Texas, looking for lost and forgotten cemeteries, so this is the kind of stuff I love to hear about. Obligatory plug for our cemetery preservation. Abandoned women's prison that's pretty much fallen apart by now. Me and some friends were walking by moonlight and occasionally our phones. We're following the path and right smack in the middle are several piles of organs from small animals, like 6-7 piles, hearts, lungs, kidneys and possibly the liver. They all looked pretty fresh, they weren't decayed and they were still pretty moist. There wasn't any blood around or obvious tracks, footprints. We noped the frick out of there with the quickness that night. I'll play the role of villain in this story. A buddy and I used to hang out in this abandoned mansion in our city, cleaning and fixing whatever fixtures were left behind. We put a lot of what into that place to make it nice, but one day a group of teenagers smashed through a glass door to come in and smoke pot. The mansion was usually pitch black in most of the rooms, but I knew the place well enough to navigate without hurting myself. These kids did not. While they're crashing and banging about in my dang project, I would follow very quietly and slide things across the floor to make noise. Eventually these kids started getting even more brazen, breaking lamps and punching holes in the wall, and one gets on the phone with a friend to set up a party. So my buddy crawls into a cabinet and starts scratching the side wall loudly, and I zoom throughout the house making vague whispering noises. These poor explorers were getting more and more anxious until they reached the main room, at which point my friend and I let out piercing screams and chased them from the place. TLDR. Sometimes your terrifying close encounter in an abandoned mansion is really some bored college students fricking with you. Out exploring around 11:30 at night in the middle of a forest, we stumbled upon an old abandoned house. Didn't seem too creepy at first until we stepped foot inside. Everything was pitch black and boarded off. Turning on our phone flashlights revealed children's toys scattered all access the floors in every room, along with tons of sex dolls and sex toys. The creepy part was when we ventured into the basement. The moment I turned the corner going down the stairs and looked in the basement, I heard a music box start playing from the other end of the room. Needless to say, the three of us booked it out of there as fast as we could. We have a video of it somewhere. Not sure if I'll be able to dig it up. This was a while ago. That's shady as frick. I don't even want to think about what the person hanging around there was doing with all that. Many years ago I was taking the train across the country to visit one of my good friends. Along the way I noticed we passed something that looked like an old abandoned freight station. But there was nothing else around. No towns. No nothing. So I don't know if this counts as urban exploration. It was reachable by car from where he lived, so when I arrived I told him about it, and we decided to go and have a look. We borrowed his parents' cars, packed some sandwiches and soft drinks and made a trip out of it. Then we drove out there, and it was really secluded. We had to do the last stretch on a gravel road. When we arrived we went in, and it looked as abandoned inside as it did outside. But down at the bottom, where there were no longer floor, but just dirt, we saw something that resembled a skeleton. At first we were a bit startled, but we went back to the car and grabbed some lights and went back in. We shined our lights, and yes, a skeleton was halfway buried in the dirt, and its hands were handcuffed on its back. We didn't really know what to do or how to react. We tried to calm each other down and tell each other that it was probably fake, but we still didn't dare touch it. In the end we called the police. Since the place didn't have an official address, it took some time to get a location. The operator told us to wait until a patrol car arrived. Then about 5 minutes later I received a call from the nearest police station. informing me that a movie was planned to be filmed, and the production team had notified the police months in advance. We felt kinda silly, having nearly shat ourselves. The police did send a car, just to be sure there wasn't any bamboozle, and since it was out in nowhere, we got to sit tight for 2 hours, while feeling super stupid. The following conversation with the police is definitely one of the more embarrassing ones I've had to endure. In retrospect it doesn't really seem creepy, but in the moment, finding a handcuffed skeleton, dang, that gave me chills like nothing I've ever experienced. It's just a conspiracy. They killed that man and just said it was a movie. I was exploring a large abandoned hospital complex and came across a house on the property. I assume it once belonged to the head of the hospital and his family, as the complex was incredibly isolated and a self-sustaining place. We climb in through a downstairs window and the house is in fairly decent shape and mostly empty, all apart from an old baby's cradle. This thing was old. It looked Victorian, like it had been lifted off an old-fashioned pram or stroller. Very gothic looking, if I'm honest. And definitely not the kind of thing you would see anymore. We walked past and made some standard "that's creepy" comments and quickly checked out the rest of the house. There wasn't much. We have to go back through the baby cradle room to get out the window, and as we walk in I stop dead in my tracks. My friend asks what's wrong and then sees for himself. The cradle has moved several feet and is rocking. There is no breeze, and even if there was, that thing is heavy enough to have left light scratches in the wooden floor. We heard and saw no one else in the area. Still cannot explain it. Maybe your friend pranked you really well. Friend and I hopped some gates to get into an abandoned power plant so that he could take photos for fun. Accidentally ran into a lab and got chased out by 6 Rottweilers and a crazy lady. That was an interesting day. There is a very large factory in Philadelphia in a bad neighborhood that had a fire, and this company decided it was time to relocate. I mean, massive building. We always went at night as we figured no sane cop would bother going in after us. Over the course of a few months my friends and I would go up to the rooftop, drink some beers or wine and work our way down, exploring as much as we could. Anything from several story tall very large rooms for equipment to office space. I actually found blueprints and was wrapping all of my gifts in them for some time. Anyway, we became very comfortable in this place. We started to get to know our way around. One of the last times I was in there we were having fun. Found some hard hats and a set of really nice mid-century chairs I was heck bent on taking with me. We get to an area maybe 3-4 stories up out of 6-8 stories. An area we hadn't been, and we all got an ominous feeling. We all felt it at once. As we proceeded we saw an older SUV, an Isuzu Rodeo, and maybe 15 feet exactly parallel was a large, square object a bit larger. It was covered in heavy plastic sheeting. Both looked like they were just placed there. Now we all feel something weird before even getting up here. Now we see these two things 3-4 freaking stories up and have no clue how they got there. Bad news all around. We are all on edge. I was curious. So I approached to SUV in this object, and right in the middle of this plastic sheeting was a slit. I pushed aside this plastic and inside was a camper. I remember looking back at everyone and saying it's a freaking camper. We all look at each other and know to get the frick out of there ASAP. As we are all running, panic sets in. I grabbed my chair. I wasn't leaving without it. My buddy is whisper yelling "you're going to get us freaking killed" as my chair is banging off of corners and hallways as I run. We start to get lost. Crap got real. I really don't think we were alone in there. I had that chair for a few years. It is a feeling I will never forget. I'm still not sure how that SUV and camper got up there. There hasn't been power there for years before, and it was literally 3-4 stories up. Maybe a large service elevator, but I never saw one. My only regret is not opening the door to that camper. I will forever wonder what was inside of there. OM lab. Obviously. You're lucky no one died. When my husband and I were traveling in Moldova, I read about an abandoned Soviet military base in the woods. It was under construction when the Soviet Union fell, and so it had just been left as it was. Another group had visited it before us and taken some pretty good pictures as well, and I had to see it for myself. This base is in the middle of nowhere. I could tell from Google satellite view that there was a road in, but when we got there, it turned out to be extremely difficult to travel this road by car. It was basically 3 square concrete blocks across, but someone had removed the middle of the 3 all the way down the road, so you'd have to balance your wheels on the other 2. There were also quite a few ruts and puddles in the road, and since we had a rental car that we didn't want to damage, we just parked near the entrance to this road and walked the 1.5 kilometers or so to the base. As we headed down this road, there was a group of 4 or 5 dogs standing in our way. We yelled to scare them off. One dog seemed curious rather than threatening and ended up following us the rest of the time we were at the base, which meant several kilometers of walking. It didn't seem very healthy and I wished we could take it home with us, but that was obviously impossible. Sadly, I didn't even have any food to offer it. As far as I'd seen, there were 3 major structures left on the base. 1, just a skeleton of a building that had never been built, was easy enough to visit, but not exceptionally interesting. Then there was the administrative building, which was much more complete, but when we got near this, a very large number of dogs started barking. There appeared to be at least 20 dogs hanging out around this building, and they didn't sound very friendly at all. We abandoned this attempt and headed in the other direction toward the 3rd building, which was basically underground and quite unique in appearance. Between us and the 3rd building was a pile of rubble which we began to clamber over when my husband, who is taller than me, stopped and said, "There's someone living back there." We decided not to get involved with whoever this person was and whatever they were doing, but my husband said there was kind of a wooden shack with a guy hanging around. As we walked back toward the car, still quite a way away from it, a white van with 2 guys inside came down the concrete path. I suppose they traveled it often since they didn't have any trouble staying on the concrete blocks on each side and had obviously dealt with the ruts. I was quite anxious about these guys and what they might be up to at this abandoned base in the middle of nowhere, but they didn't stop or give us any trouble. All of this was probably fairly harmless, but since I hadn't really expected to see any life at all in this abandoned Soviet base in the middle of nowhere, it felt very creepy. Weathered barn. 100s of body-shaped burlap sacks everywhere. Stables that required climbing down a ladder that's under a trapped door, which is unexposed by hay, to access. Pictures of different women scattered everywhere. That sounds like an episode of Criminal Minds. I was exploring a drainage pipe in an abandoned park when we found a pentagram on the wall. About 15 feet further into the tunnel, we heard a laugh like a middle-aged man's laugh. We booked it out of there and came back a week later. Pentagram was still there, laugh wasn't though. TLDR. Followed a mysterious ghost dog all night, only to be led to something even creepier than the dog was. A friend and I were exploring a newly abandoned building in the middle of the night, but that's not where the creepiness happened unless you count a giant pentagram spray painted on the floor. It was a college town, so we didn't think much of it. Before we really got much exploring done, we heard a dog barking nearby, so we went to see if we could find it. We did. Well, sort of. The dog was wearing a collar, so we were trying to get close enough to read the owner's information. It would let us get a couple of feet away before taking off again at lightning speed. Not that abnormal, but it got weirder. At one point we had it cornered at the bottom of a set of stairs into what was essentially a walled pit behind one of the dormitories. We watched it go down the stairs. My friend followed the dog down the stairs while I stood on the top of the brick wall to watch the dog as it ran behind one of the dumpsters. When my friend reached the area where the dumpsters were, the dog wasn't there. The door to the building was locked. I had not seen it run back up the steps and had been keeping an eye on the whole area, so it's doubtful I would have missed it. Then we heard the dog howling nearby, but not from where we thought it would be. Somewhat strange, but still this could be possible, right? So we followed the howling, because at this point, it was getting a bit eerie. We didn't see the dog again for a while, but kept hearing it howling nearby. It was definitely moving. We followed it up a steep hill which led off campus into a wooded area. At this point we'd been chasing this dog for several hours. As the sun was about to come up, we were still determined, especially after a whole night of chasing this mysterious dog. And this is where it got even weirder. We reached a steep embankment as we drew closer to the howling, whose tone had become almost mournful. We wondered if the dog was sick or hurt, so we climbed up to the top. What we found up there was not what we'd expected. There was no dog. Instead there was a very old cabin which had almost completely collapsed with all the former owner's possessions still inside. There were no other cabins around. but that in itself wasn't terribly strange so much as it was interesting. And then, beside the cabin, we discovered what remained of an old dog house, its pen knocked over and covered by pine needles. We never found the dog, and its howling stopped as soon as we reached the abandoned structure. By an old gun position I found a hatch leading down to the crew shelter. I climbed down and found myself in the standard L-shaped passage to the domed shelter. As I turned the corner I nearly stepped on the complete skeleton of a deer. There was no flesh but the bones seemed to have some sort of white fungus on them as they glowed very white in the torchlight. I felt very sorry for the poor thing as it hadn't had a hope in heck of getting out after it fell in. TLDR. Explored an abandoned house while being watch-followed without my knowledge and then was asked to leave without any verbal communication. I was hitchhiking into Canada from Montana after a trip down to Arizona. It was cold and I was headed to Alberta to work at a ski resort for the winter. Just after crossing the border, I came across an abandoned house. With an old barn it seemed like a decent place to spend a night, where I could get out of the wind. My first stop was the house. I looked around for a bit and recall spooking an owl in one of the front rooms. I also heard something near the back in the kitchen which I assumed was spooked by the owl. I did a full tour of the place and came across only a few sparse things like some family photos in the kitchen alcove, where a table once stood, and some old clothing. It was pretty windy in the house except for this spot since the roof had big holes and the windows had all been smashed. So I threw down my bag by the back steps and walked towards the barn. About halfway between the barn and the house I had this eerie feeling that I ignored. I checked out the barn and spent a while climbing to the loft and snooping in places. Without a light it was hard to see, and it was not any warmer with lots of boards missing. As I exited the barn after 20 or so minutes, I was surprised that there was my bag leaning against the wall, about 60 feet from the house where I had left it. I stopped for a moment and hesitation made my heart rate rise. Then I got out my only defense, which was a larger folding knife that I was not prepared to use, and wearily approached the house while yelling hello. I stayed a safe distance away and made my exit to the road while going around to the front of the house. As I started to walk away down the road, I looked back and felt like there was a man standing in the window by the doorway, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't wave as I really didn't want to know and just kept watch behind me as I kept walking towards the highway. I was lucky to get a ride shortly thereafter by a trucker, to whom I shared my tale, but don't think I slept much the next few days. Large abandoned federal prison. It was a sanctioned tour, so not sure if that counts as urban exploration, but it was dark and creepy and there were physical safety issues. Went through the psych ward and the infirmary as the last stops of the tour, then we were allowed to just wander freely. My group of 4 went back to the psych ward. This time there was a huge raven dead in the middle of the floor of the first room on the psych ward. Its head was at a crazy angle and it was lying in a puddle of blood that was still wet. All windows were closed and intact. We left and re-entered through the only door that led to the rest of the building. Nobody saw or heard anything like a bird, and it was the middle of the night, so it wouldn't have just been flying around. Made me think there were probably creepy squatters who weren't happy about the overnight tours, which had just started the week before, so it really gave me the creeps. This is more in my city limits, but I think it counts. I was exploring an abandoned factory 9 blocks away from my house. It was closed because a major fire broke loose and half of it was burned to heck. My mates and I had the bright idea to explore it. We took flashlights, kinfs, and our phones. It was 6 PM, so it was turning dark. We went in, found nothing interesting until about 27 minutes of exploring my mate found some bloody cloths. Seemed to be a bit aged. Seeing that, I was myself in fear and begging to leave, but everyone wanted to stay and continue. We looked for anything related to it. After about 6 minutes we heard someone scream bloody murder. They didn't say bloody murder, just sounded like it. After hearing that I ran out of there and all my mates. Still wonder what happened. West lawn of Riverview Mental Hospital in Vancouver has been shut down for close to 20 years now. Been in all the buildings multiple times and seen the typical creepy crap. Bed frames, wheelchairs, satanic graffiti, but the creepiest has to be a backpack I found in the basement. It was covered in mold and filled with tools to break into the building with, but the weird part is I found a receipt in the bag. for most of the tools, and this was only 5 days prior to me finding the moldy backpack. Still leaves me with chills. I do have photos, videos if anyone is interested. I'm interested in seeing any photos and videos you have of the place. Abandoned meatpacking plant in Fort Worth, now since torn down. Often found hatchets and old fires. Nothing crazy. Until our most recent trip where we found a pile of crusty panties, very obviously belonging to little girls. We stopped going there after that. I was only a kid at the time, but me and a friend discovered a vault-like door down by the harbor. We pried it open and peeked inside. A single room that seemed to be a long corridor, filled with trash, old newspapers and with graffiti on the walls. We went inside, poked around, and got further down the corridor. In the end of the room there was a crappy, cracked plastic table filled to the brim with stumps of used candles. We quickly realized that someone lived there, and got as fast as possible. It might not seem that scary now, but at the time it was terrifying. I was like 12 years old, after all. It wasn't creepy, but mysterious in a way. A toilet seat, about 10 miles away from any buildings or civilization, and there was just a freaking toilet seat hanging from a rope in the woods. So somebody had to physically transport this toilet seat, then hike uphill through dense woods for over a mile to get it to its location. You couldn't drive to the spot, and then hang the toilet seat in a tree for reasons that we will never know. Really more amusing than anything. When I was young we had a forest back behind the neighborhood. My sister, her friends, and I decided to go explore the forest. We ended up finding a well and an old bridge that had a cellar under it. All 5 of us girls decided to pick up a huge branch to hold onto. Our logic was so we can all be connected, haha. Slowly made our way down the stairs to check out the room. I was in front. The girl behind me was super close, so we were the first to see in. We both swore we saw a noose hanging up. Both screamed at the same time and pushed everyone back up. My sister didn't believe us but refused to go down. We hightailed it out of the forest. A couple years later the city tore it all down, so I never got the change to go back once I got a little older. I never got the chance to go back. Good thing, too. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.